That's right, you got a few other Commonwealthers here. It is so good to see you all. I want to thank the NRA and CPAC for this award. I very much appreciate it, and I guess I was lucky. It must have been a slow year, so that's okay too. But even before, so many people think of attorneys general and associate us with many of our law enforcement duties. Fighting gangs, fraud, human trafficking is a growing scourge. But the first thing in my oath of office, the first duty that I'm obliged to pursue is the defense of the U.S. and Virginia constitutions. And that is a duty that I take very seriously. And it is one that sadly I think many people in elected office, they say the oath because you have to say it to assume your seat. And they quickly forget it, and they don't defend that Constitution, even when it is obvious that they should do so. And in my role as Attorney General, we have had the necessity or opportunity, the requirement of circumstances of the history that we find ourselves in today to push back on this federal government when it breaks the laws or violates the Constitution. And you all know that separation of powers is the division of authority and power between the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches, and it's designed that way. It was designed that way by the founders so that no one part of the federal government could get so powerful that it could assume the tyrannical status that they had rebelled against. Federalism, I think of as vertical separation of powers between the federal government and the states, where the states are intended to check the federal government's power. That is part of the purpose of the relationship between states and the federal government. And the federal government was created with limited powers, was supposed to be created with limited powers. But as we, the American people, have gradually asked it to do more, a little bit here and a little bit there over time and through history, we have gradually created a government that is no longer very limited. We have, in fact, a central government that tries to plan and control virtually every aspect of our lives and our country. I'm happy today that we can say that we're a couple of years into people just being absolutely fed up. And that's a good thing in this circumstance. That's a good thing. Today, the idea of federalism is reemerging as a way to rein in the excesses of Washington. States are now pushing back, not just Virginia. We play a leadership role, and where better to play a leadership role? You've got Madison and Monroe here, two of the founders on opposite sides of the U.S. constitutional debate. James Monroe voted against the U.S. Constitution because he didn't think it was cautious enough with respect to federal power. Seems like he had a crystal ball, one might think. But that's a role of states when the federal government oversteps these boundaries. And the worst example, of course, is the health care bill that David referred to. It was actually signed, David, on March 23rd. It passed out of the House on the 21st, signed by the President on March 23rd, 2010, and about 34 minutes later, give or take, we filed suit in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. Now, it is interesting, and I didn't realize it till that night when I was on a conference call with some of the Tea Party leaders of Virginia. We filed suit in the Eastern District of Virginia in the Richmond Division at 700 East Broad Street in Richmond. 17 blocks to the east, 235 years to the day before we filed that suit and before the President signed that bill, Patrick Henry gave his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. On the same street. And that seemed very appropriate, given that that legislation represents one of the greatest legislative invasions of liberty in the lifetime of anyone in this room. And that suit that we filed is not about health care. It's about liberty. It is not about health care. It is not about health insurance. It's about liberty. And as we watch the continuing rampage, and that is what it is, against liberty of that federal health care bill, as we watch it continue to unfold with the most recent HHS mandate, assaulting our religious institutions, we know that it has to be stopped. Certainly the founders would think so. Even before that health care lawsuit, that was 2 months into my term as AG, 1 month in we sued the EPA, which I've taken to calling the Employment Prevention Agency, because they're so good at that, for their greenhouse gas endangerment finding. At the end of this month, the 28th and 29th, Virginia and Texas will argue on behalf of 16 states that they broke the law. And mind you, that's when an attorney general steps in. Just because I don't like a policy doesn't bring me to court. That's what elections are for. Only when they break the law or violate the Constitution. And when the EPA said that CO2 that you are exhaling right now, let's all just annoy Lisa Jackson together, shall we? 1, 2, 3. Hi, Lisa. When they passed that regulation in violation of the law, they brought on enormous consequences, many of which they hadn't calculated, in which they say they hadn't calculated. Those are the economic consequences. The only science behind that regulation is political science. That's it. The EPA issued those regulations without regard for the economic impact, without regard for whether the science behind it was correct, right or wrong. They relied on a UN-associated scientist. We now know them as the ClimateGate scientists. And so we are suing to reopen those hearings and let truth be considered in the consideration of that regulation. You all are familiar with the National Labor Relations Board's assault on South Carolina and Boeing. Make no mistake about it, that is an assault on the right to work. And by the right to work, I refer to the now 23 states, with the addition of Indiana, the right to hold a job without being coerced to join a union. And that was the federal government's attack on that right. In the FCC, we see them ignoring court orders, telling them they cannot regulate the internet. The Office of Surface Mining, probably not an agency you're all that familiar with. Southwest Virginia, Appalachia, the poorest part of America is coal country, and we protect coal country by protecting the law, We have never seen such an across-the-board assault on the rule of law by any administration in the lifetime of anyone in this room. It has never happened. The Constitution gets no respect, states get no respect, the courts get no respect, federal law itself that they find inconvenient gets no respect. And when we don't have enough politicians in Washington who adhere to the Constitution and the rule of law, state attorneys general become the last line of defense. And we are working to preserve the Constitution and the founding principles of this nation, including the rule of law itself, not only in Virginia, where I would point out it all began, but across America, with the attorneys general in Texas, South Carolina, Florida, Michigan, of all places, Arizona, Oklahoma. The list goes on as we add to the ranks of those whose first concern is that first item in their oath of office, and we are adding them across America. Ronald Reagan told us many years ago that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and hand it on for them to do the same, or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in America where men were free. Thank you all. Just haul this puppy out of here?
Yeah, you haul that baby home. Let's get a picture of that.